morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Judy Samuelson. I work for the Aspen Institute, and I run the Business and Society program, which is longstanding what the Institute calls policy program. But our work's not about really policy so much. It's really about engaging business, and starts with the belief that we simply can't address our most consequential problems globally, locally, without business at the table in a fulsome way. And so we're really excited to kind of be able to dive into the conversation that's been unfolding during this summit so far today. We're reminded by listening to some of these earlier speakers that this is a remarkably consequential moment in which we're engaging this conversation. The conversation about growing inequality is one that we feel here at home in the United States of America, but is of course playing out regionally. It is having political ramifications. We're experiencing all of the same kind of concerns over public health and climate that people experience in other parts of the world. And yet we have this remarkable capacity of business. And today I'm delighted to welcome three kind of fellow travelers who represent corporations that are globally and regionally significant enterprises that can be part of the problem if we are not aligned with the long-term health, but today increasingly are part of the solution. And I'm pleased to be able to present Suzanne Ackerman-Berman. She's a transformation director and chairman of Ackerman Pick and Pay Foundation and the Pick and Pay Group. And this is a very significant retailer that operates in the southern cone of Africa, but headquartered in Cape Town. And she's part of the longstanding family that is part of the Pick and Pay experience, and has a remarkable story to tell, and will hopefully capture that when she can rejoin us. Neal Kemkar, wave Neal. Neal is the executive counsel at General Electric, a large U.S. corporation. We're going to learn more about that corporation through Neal. He's part of the governmental relations staff and the sustainability staff, and is responsible for a lot of the thought leadership in this domain. And then Raimundo Cañas. He is the executive director of community development banking at PNC Bank and operates out of Houston, and is a longtime community banker, worked at so many banks I could barely even name them all. We know each of you well at the Business and Society program because you have all been through our First Mover Fellowship program, and I've asked a colleague to drop a link to that program in chat. And that program essentially operates with two basic ideas. One, business has remarkable capacity and choices to make in pursuit of inclusive growth, but sometimes it's complicated. And when you're able to work with internal agents of change who are as passionate and about these questions, these global questions where business meets society and interacts, and this kind of ongoing conversation and exchange about the role of corporations. We need these change agents inside to kind of tweak the message, engage their fellow travelers, build strategy that really resounds within the corporation, listen well to all of those who are trying to influence the business, and on in this constant conversation about really embracing and leveraging the extraordinary capacity of globally and regionally significant corporations. And so I'm delighted to kind of lead off this conversation. And again, we're hoping that Suzanne can rejoin us. So Neal, let's start with you. We all feel like, maybe in the United States anyway, we feel like we know what GE is and does. But I'm guessing a lot of us are out of date with the GE of today. And I was actually hoping you just kind of introduce us to the corporation. Like, what does it really do today? What's its real strengths? Where does it make its money? And tell us your role within it. And then we'll come back around.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Judy. And thanks to everyone. Gratitude to our friends at the Aspen Institute see Judy and Missy Nancy in this conversation as well. Thank you all for what you do at the intersection of business and society. And thanks for this amazing conversation and platform to push an important issue here. Look, GE today is really, after a century plus of being an ongoing concern, is about building, powering, moving, and curing the world. And we've got a number of different business units. I know folks probably know us from our legacy appliances or light bulbs, but these days we focus on 4 major business units. One's aviation, the other is conventional power. 1/3 of the world's electricity comes from GE equipment. Healthcare, precision healthcare, large CT scanners, MRIs, hospital equipment largely, and renewable energy, some of the world's largest offshore and onshore wind turbines primarily, but also hydro. And so that's what we do today, Judy. My role, I help lead environmental policy for the company, regulatory issues. And what that means is I sit here in Washington, D.C. at the intersection of public policy and one of the country's, iconic corporations. And so we get pulled into the crosshairs increasingly of more and more issues of the day, whether they have a direct or indirect business nexus to us. And we're just having to deal with those issues on an increasing basis, particularly as folks look to the private sector, in addition to some of the historical sectors that are working on these issues to solve some of the toughest challenges of today. So appreciate the chance to be in this conversation.
Great, thanks for joining us. And Ray, tell us a little bit about PNC. I know this is a relatively new position for you. You had been at BBVA when you first joined the fellowship program, but tell us a little bit more about the reach of the bank you work for and kind of what services is it generally rendering, who's it's reaching?
Absolutely, thanks Judy, and it's great to be on, great to see the Aspen family get together, at least in this kind of a forum. So I have been at PNC all of 3 days, and there's Suzanne. I've been at PNC all of 3 days. This is the week right after BBVA USA has been integrated into PNC Bank. It just happened this past weekend. But I've been at the company for 12 years now, and what PNC offers across the country, it's a Pittsburgh-based financial institution, but it's a big Main Street bank. We're the 6th largest bank in the country with branches and operations in 29 of the 30 largest markets in the United States. So a pretty big bank. And we offer, all the traditional services you can imagine, from commercial banking, small business, finance, and obviously consumer retail banking. My space in particular, where I sit at the bank, is within the corporate responsibility group. And I lead an area within community development banking that is responsible for delivering on products, philanthropy, and programs that impact low to moderate income communities. So I am in charge of the Texas to California, the Southwest market for PNC. And my team that sits across these states, works on real estate transactions like multifamily, low-income housing development, community facilities finance, opportunity zone financing, lending related to low-income housing tax credits and new markets tax credits. So a variety of products, and also working with alternative loan funds, CDFIs, that make loans happen that banks can't do. So all of that kind of lending and investment, plus the philanthropy associated with it.
Great. Well, welcome to you both, and to Suzanne again. Neal, can you help us understand what Suzanne's going through right now? I'm serious. She talked about load sharing in South Africa.
She did, yeah. So Suzanne, who I hope can join us briefly, or in a brief moment here, is experiencing a load shedding event in which her local utility is having to shut off some electricity because it can't quite meet the demand. And that's actually part of our inclusive conversation that we're going to get into here at GE. One of our major parts of our business is helping bring that billion people who currently don't have access to reliable, affordable electricity around the world, largely in Suzanne's neck of the woods, have access to it. When I think about, and hey, Suzanne, and just to finish this thought, and want to turn to her in a moment, just when I think about what's happening here with her internet connection, it calls to me the conversation that President Clinton was leading around broadband connectivity earlier, and how Froman and Porterfield were talking at the outset about sort of at the base of the pyramid connectivity. I mean, internet and broadband is certainly important, as we're finding out, but you really can't have that without something even closer to the base of the pyramid, which is stable, reliable electricity, which 1 billion people around the world currently don't have. And it affects everything, including their ability to join this important dialogue, Suzanne.
This global conversation. Suzanne, can you hear us okay? And if you go off mute, I'm going to ask you to introduce your company to us, and we will do the best we can to keep you in the conversation, but we're talking about you behind your back. So just welcome, glad you're here.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks, guys. And I'm really sorry about this. And Neal, it was absolutely perfect example, wasn't it? I mean, we couldn't have planned that better. So please, can we ask the president to send some power here to South Africa? So I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Suzanne Ackerman-Berman from the Pick and Pay group of companies here in Southern Africa. We are a family-controlled business, and I've been in the company for 26 years. It was founded by my parents. We are retailers. We have over 2,000 supermarkets across 8 countries in Africa, and we employ over 90,000 people. And I have a turnover of a couple of billion US. And the one thing that's kept us going over the 56 years that we've been busy is the being in this business is the whole concept of doing good is good business, reaching out to the societies who serve us, and ensuring that all stakeholders are absolutely included in the economic minefield that's out there. So it's not just about profiteering at the end of the day. And I think we heard that from some of the other companies earlier today. It's about the impact that one can make from a social, an economic, and an environmental perspective.
So Suzanne, let's start with you. Can you give us an example, like bring this alive? Give us an example of something you're actually doing. Tell your story. I know you're a storyteller. Tell us a story.
Okay, so I live in Africa. And I think most of you who know what the continent of Africa is about is we have extremely limited resources. Electricity not being the major one of them. It's water, it's access to facilities, and it's access to the formal economy for small-scale entrepreneurs and businesses. And what we as a company have believed for many, many years is that we have an obligation and a duty to reach out to those who have been previously disadvantaged. And in a company like South Africa, previously disadvantaged usually means individuals of race, and particularly Black women, have been excluded from the economy for whatever reason, whether it was legislated, whether it was during apartheid times. And in order for them to catch up, it has been a huge stress and strain on the economy and on society. So what we as a company have been involved with for the last 15 years is building a small business incubator, reaching out to small scale farmers, suppliers, entrepreneurs, holding their hands and bringing them into the formal economy. Converting small scale pig farmers, someone who's just farming in their backyard, a couple of pigs, and bringing them in as full-scale commercial pig farmers who are now bringing in over 400 carcasses a week into the formal economy, which means helping build abattoirs, helping upskill the individuals, helping plant the fields so that the right formula and the right fodder is actually on the ground for the animals, and empowering those around them as well.
So how do you do this? Can you briefly, very briefly, we have so little time together, very briefly give us an example. Do you actually staff these kinds of functional skill building internally? You work with a nonprofit? Like what's an MO?
We do it ourselves. We do it. We realize that within our own organization of 90,000 employees, we have the expertise ourselves. So we have people who are experts in supply chain, we have technologists, we have accountants, we have all the expertise that is required within our business to reach out, facilitate, and help small-scale entrepreneurs. And that's exactly how we've been engaging and doing this over the last couple of years. And to date, we have over 2,000 small, micro, and medium entrepreneurs who are supplying into this enormous retail business, not only to us. Many of them are exporting, some are supplying other retailers, and it's actually upskilled and created thousands of jobs across all sectors of society.
And over how many countries is this starting to take hold or expanding?
In all the countries that we are in, we try and utilize the local entrepreneurship and the local farming communities. We try as best as possible not to import our goods and try to remain as local as possible. But the entrepreneurial program itself is running mainly here within the South African borders.
So it's an interesting, just a quick point, and then Ray, I'm going on to you, that this is a choice. This is a choice. This is a choice,
exactly,
presumably, that any retailer could make, or in some respects, any business that has that kind of direct supply chain that is within their control. Fair?
Absolutely, Judy. I think it's a conscious effort that one should make as a business to actually put more back into society than we take out. And I was listening, sorry.
No, go.
And I believe it is a conscious effort that anybody, any entrepreneur, I mean, any corporate, any large multinational can physically make that shift to put back more into society, whether it's being the voice of every single one of their consumers. And that means listening to the social issues at play, whether it's listening to the issues of gender-based violence and assisting your staff, whether it's issues of poverty, alleviation of poverty, access to financial acumen, whatever it is, we as the corporates have the power, have the ability to reach out and make a difference.
And one very quick on this one, Suzanne, how important has it been that you are a member of the founding family in kind of moving this forward? Or do you think this could have happened if anybody had the inclination to try to engage?
It's an interesting question. I think I have a loud voice, very luckily, and I make my voice heard, but I think it's the ethos of the company and it's the value system that's driven the company from inception. And many companies these days are talking about values, are talking about purpose. And now my quest out there is to get companies to actually live their value system, live their purpose. And it can be deeply ingrained into the ethos of any company. You don't have to be part of the founding family.
So thank you. Ray, on to you. You've worked at 5-6 banks, so don't feel that you have to, maintain, just the focus on your current employer, but happy to hear an example of what's going on there. First of all, define it a little bit more for us, not long, short definition of what inclusive growth really means at PNC, and then give us some color. How does it actually play? An example.
Sure. I think one really good and important example, given what's going on really all over the world, but especially in the United States, is PNC did make last year $1 billion pledge towards racial equity and social justice. And so very specifically trying to address the inequities that affect our Black colleagues, our Black community members, Black entrepreneurs. So it's not just philanthropy, it's literally trying to get capital into projects that support the Black community, that support Black homeowners, Black business owners. So sorry.
Does that operate as is it integrated at all into the business investment decision making, or is it a separate?
It is, yeah. So actually, it's primarily in the hands of the team that I work in community development banking. But it really is something that even at the local level, right, every regional president has a focus on how do we make racial equity live within the work that PNC does. But thinking about sort of a really clear example of this work being inclusive in community development finance. So some of the really interesting ways that a bank can make sort of its power come to life, right? So banks are intermediaries of capital, right? So we take deposits from consumers and companies, and then put them to work. So the really powerful thing that a bank can do is to then use some of that capital for the benefit of community in ways that are creative, innovative, not exactly expensive. So these nonprofit loan funds that I've worked with for quite a bit in many banks, loan funds that can be microcredit, they can be working on real estate, they can be working on, a variety of things. Small business lending is another example. Those make use of capital, right? So the banks, what we do is we then give low interest, either equity investments, equity-like investments, or even just debt to these loan funds that can then really reach deeply into the community, right? With individuals, with families, with home buyers, to then make the capital get used in a way that a bank wouldn't be able to because of our risk tolerance, right? So if we give one of these loan funds a 1% or 2% investment over 10 years, they could really use that then and charge a little bit of a higher margin to then be self-sustaining, but use that money to then lend and invest out into the community. It's really impactful, and it's especially important for sort of the minority-led and minority-serving loan funds out there.
So in this case, you're financing kind of an intermediary system of financing. So the retail decision-making that is inherent in trying to reach smaller enterprises and ones that have been kind of not have the same access to capital, it's part of building an infrastructure of players that can do that. This is a fairly common approach, right? Community development loan funds and the like. What do you see in terms of the trend lines here? And then we're going to move on to Neal. Do you think this is a growth area, or does it get cloistered because of its peculiar artifact that you have to work through these intermediaries? Like, what's a constraint here? I guess that's what I'd like to know.
Like I was mentioning right at the end of my comment, I think the real challenge is that all of these constructs are still sort of they're still within the mainstream, right? The notions are still sort of mainstream finance. So it's really those that are working more in the fringes, working really deeply in very impoverished communities and in minority communities that are still challenged by, right? Not all of these loan funds are minority-led, as an example. So there's still, ceilings there for growth, for women, for minorities. And then on top of that, right, they still don't have enough capital. I mean, they are not banks. So they're micro versions of a financial institution, and they still need a lot of subsidy and a lot of equity to really make things work. So luckily, right, we've got a lot of great federal and local government support for them, whether it's loan loss reserves, right, helping to provide capital in case of losses of default by the borrowers. But also there's a lot of subsidy for innovative models, innovative processes. So some of the federal programs are still intact and actually are growing. The pandemic has sort of really unveiled, right, this gap that small business owners aren't operating, right, with sort of this huge multi-month savings when sales, shut down last year and we had lockdowns. So these loan funds had to be sort of the saviors, right, of some of these entrepreneurs in spite of PPP or other government programs.
So Neal, on to you. Thank you, Ray. On to you, and help us understand how you interpret, in particular at GE. How do you interpret inclusive growth? You did talk about the example of access to energy as one example. Would you want to expand on that, or is there a broader definition?
Sure. Look, I mean, that's one example, but that's not the definition for me, at least. And I would love to hear from the other folks, on the panel we've heard, but the attendees, if they want to go to the chat and give us their short answer to what is inclusive growth. I would say mine is improving people's lives as you do business. And so for that, you talk about telling stories. This is Thomas Edison's company. GE started really with the first incandescent light bulb, the first power grid. In the healthcare space, we're talking about the first X-rays machines in the world, the first television broadcast. When you think about how that, now questionable whether television today is really improving people's lives. But when you think about the democratization that came initially with television, all those things are about improving people's lives. I mean, that's our history. And so how does that, map to today? Well, today, it's kind of builds on that through line of innovation and talking about today building some of the world's most powerful wind turbines to help with the sustainability challenge, moving, light speed ahead of yesterday's onshore and offshore wind turbines to things today that are, connected with hundreds and hundreds of sensors, and just that are internet connected, have 3D printed parts that are lighter and more agile than before, to essentially keep moving the frontier ahead on sustainability. And I think that that's part of it, improving people's lives in ways that they get individually at the individual consumer level, but also in the background, continuing to improve things. And we've heard, Ray and Suzanne talk about things they're doing on both scores. Not to say, Ray, you brought up the pandemic, and it was a big through line this morning as well. On a personal note, I think we're all feeling and seeing how, COVID has really both exposed and exacerbated the inequities in our society. But for me, the way I grew up, the child of immigrants, as a first generation, American, a lot of folks that I know are on the wrong side of this K-shaped recovery. And so as I think about how important it is, especially now, it's never been more important to focus on building a more sustainable, inclusive economy, and our companies are part of that. Like you say, they're not the answer by themselves, and by any stretch of the imagination, but they have to be a part of that solution. There's just too much at stake.
Is there any particular example that speaks to you, Neal, here about what GE is kind of delving into?
Yeah, I'll give just two or three quick examples. I already touched on, at the same time, the developed world is trying to meet, the challenge of code red for humanity on climate and how we decarbonize all that great electricity access we have, right? We talked earlier in this summit about challenges with broadband, but we don't have challenges with electricity here in the United States. We have 100% access to electricity. If we look to Suzanne's, neighborhood, South Africa itself, 85% connectivity, but next door in Botswana, 70%, Namibia, 53%. You go down to Mozambique, it's under 30% connectivity. If you think about that as the base of the pyramid for everything else, that's a huge problem. And those people, fundamentally, if we're talking about building an inclusive world, and as Mr. Banga talked about, we're all deeply interconnected. If those folks don't have access to that fundamental sort of human piece of it, the rest of it, they stand a much worse chance of success, and then that accrues to all of our disbenefit. The same thing on precision healthcare. Right now, 50% of the world's population lacks access to essential health services. And so when we think about the, very expensive, very sophisticated machines that any of us, our families, might have access to if they were to get ill or get, need that, we're almost expecting that access. But half of the world doesn't have that. And you can imagine what the healthcare outcomes are when you don't have access to those services. And then finally, flight, Judy, when we think about being able to fly from DC to Aspen for a conversation of the First Movers Fellows, I expect in the main that there'll not only be available options, but multiple carriers competing for it. And that I'll be able to check for prices. More and more people, as they enter the middle class around the world, are going to demand the same standard of living. And so we'll see, but for this very important and near-term blip, for public health reasons, you're just going to see more and more people flying and demanding access to not just international, but domestic flights. And as that happens, that's a sector that's really hard to electrify right now, unlike the land-based transportation sector with electric vehicles. So how do we deal with that challenge of making smarter, more efficient flight by reducing greenhouse gas emissions through some cutting-edge technologies? It's another big challenge we're taking on. So for me, those are some of the ways that I think about the inclusive growth.
So a quick follow-up to you, Neal, and then Suzanne, I'd love to have your kind of reaction to what Neal was talking about, since you're living much closer to the ground in terms of this lack of access that Neal's talking to. But you talk about half of the world not having access. I think it was in the case of electricity. What does GE mean in that vast kind of gap? In other words, how significant is GE, either as a direct provider, as a technology provider, as a partner with governments? How do you think about that kind of scale? And then the other part of that, which I think I'm going to ask all of us to start thinking about, is where's the need for collaboration, B2B collaboration here? Can you reflect on those two things, Neal? What does GE mean to all of this? And what kinds of collaborations are required to really move the needle?
Yeah, happy to, Judy. Look, scale, we're all about scale. We operate in 100 we have customers, I should say, in 170 countries. When we talk about electricity, I think I hinted at this earlier. Already, we operate 1/3 of the world's electricity is generated with GE equipment. So when we're talking about that gap, we feel we're one of the best placed private sector enterprises, partnering with philanthropy, as you mentioned, nation states, sovereign governments, and local private sector players. We think we're well placed to be part of that solution. On the precision healthcare side, right now, that big steel that we were talking about, the CT scans, MRIs, all those things, a lot of infant health, maternal health equipment around the world. We serve more than 1 billion patients a year. So obviously a big track record. And when we talk about scale, the opportunity, yes, to outfit Mount Sinai in New York, but also folks in India, where my family is, or in Southern Africa, where Suzanne is, with things that make sense for them, but are still precision healthcare as well in their context. And then the future of flight. Every 2 seconds, but every 2 seconds, somewhere in the world, a flight takes off or lands with GE technology or one of our partners. We've got the largest, youngest aviation fleet in the world. And so,
is there any course correction in the business model that actually picks up the pace, Neal, or is it priced appropriately? Are you infinite growth opportunity? How do you think about that? And then Suzanne, we're going to go back to you.
Big question. I think it is about being a global company that's also a local company. Ultimately, GE is a proud American company, but with our footprint around the world, we have teams that try to understand, to your question, what is the need locally. And we work on our R&D side of things to make sure that we have the right stuff to sell into those places at the right price points. But most importantly, it's what do our customers need where they are? And sort of to your earlier point of listening, I think that's what it's about. We know that the same solution isn't going to work all around the world or even all around this country, as we see certainly in the electricity context. So it's a lot of listening.
So Suzanne, back to you, but open for your comments. Any of you, like anything that strikes you that you'd like to react to. We've got about another 12 minutes, I think, before we'll need to shut down. But Suzanne, what's your reaction hearing Neal from our privileged place on the eastern coast of the United States talk about your needs and trying to serve them commercially?
I think we are speaking at opposite ends of the universe here, because unfortunately the needs in Africa are certainly nowhere near the needs of what Neal is alluding to. And I wish that our access to technology and green energy was topmost in our minds. Unfortunately, we have millions and millions of mouths to feed every single day. So alleviation of poverty and access to clean water, access to running water, access to food remains our primary issue on the continent of Africa every single day. And it's through collaborations like we have around this table here, where we could actually try and help identify the immediate needs and address them together. So how do we help build more wells? How do we help broader communities with access to nearby villages? How do we help farming techniques? How do we help actually feed Africa? Because without food, we cannot educate and we cannot actually grow ourselves up away from this, the base of the pyramid. And I just want to mention something quickly with, after this horrendous year of COVID, we realized at the beginning of COVID how many millions and millions of school children are actually going to be hungry every single day because their primary source of food for their daily needs had been cut off when the schools were closed during the pandemic. Yep. And there again, it became an opportunity for us as an organization and other corporates to step up and create an opportunity to help feed children. And that's how our one foundation called Feed the Nation was born. And to date, Judy, it's been absolutely frightening to sit down and quantify that we've created 33 million meals, which wouldn't have been created beforehand. And that was with collaborating with our suppliers, with other organizations, with people like both these guys sitting on the call here today saying, help us feed the nation, help us feed the hundreds and thousands of children who have no parents, the child-headed households. These are the issues that we as African society face on a daily basis. And we need companies like my colleagues here on the call.
Ray, Neal, reactions?
I think absolutely. In fact, going back to the example I was giving, right? Most of what we do in investing to like even loan funds, right? It's because other banks are helping us share the risk. So other players, whether it's corporations, foundations, or other financial institutions, right? That's how it works, right? It's kind of like insurance. If we all put in our part, put in our piece, then it makes it all palatable and tangible, and we mitigate risk. But I completely agree with Suzanne. I mean, I think especially I grew up on the Texas-Mexico border, and Neal probably is familiar as well. It is one of the places, in fact, the city that I grew up was highlighted by New York Times, McAllen, Texas, that has one of the lowest levels of internet access. So there's kids that have to go back to school to be able to turn in homework, right? They have to go back to school in the dark using their parents' perhaps cracked cell phone to be able to upload homework. So we still have a lot of work to do, in communities in the United States, and collaboration is how we can resolve for that. So there's more that I think needs to be done, and certainly intersectionality. Just thinking about, right, it's not just one factor; there's multiple factors that need to get addressed.
Anything that jumps out at you, Ray, on the constraints here on this side? Like, what's holding us back?
I think a lot of good has come because the public, the consumer, is literally applying the pressure, right? So you see brands taking stands, right, as a theme, but that's because consumers, stakeholders are asking for that of the companies they buy from. And I think that they're removing constraints, right? It wouldn't be normal for a CEO to take a position, for example, on LGBTQ equality, but that's sort of a demand now of consumers. And I think the same will go as we think about other issues, whether it's poverty alleviation, right, more access to capital, et cetera. So I hope that we keep removing those constraints, and stakeholders' input is really important in that.
Neal, any reaction, or I've got something else I'm going to put on the table?
Just a brief one. Just gratitude to both of you and Suzanne for those millions of meals that you all prepared. That's those children you're describing. That's how I grew up. I ate at school, and so thinking about what President Clinton said this morning about the thing that really breaks people's spirits the most is this feeling of being frozen, right? Like being stuck and wanting to get unstuck. I can't think of anything that would, in these last 18 months that really stuck, made people feel stuck more than that fundamental of not knowing where their next food security or meal is going to come from. So thank you for leading on that.
Thank you.
I want to put a kind of a question on the table about kind of leadership and employeeship, if you will. We're seeing so many examples of change that feels like it's happening not because of consumers. I'm not saying that they're not present, but they're a very diffused and sometimes confused thing to talk about because they come in all shapes and sizes. And I would say consumers are as much drawn to price and convenience as they are to the lofty ideals of an inclusive and sustainable economy. And I think it creates kind of a confusing picture of consumerism, at least from the vantage point of living in the US. But I'm curious about the employee piece, because we seem to be seeing real change happen, in part because employees themselves are leaning into their own enterprise that they know best. And in some respects, can see these connections that Suzanne is talking about and that you're all talking about, and maybe both have the a sense of urgency and a sense of pride about whether or not we're at the table in a substantive way, and also seeing the ways in which maybe there's something that doesn't feel right, that we're saying over here, but maybe we're doing over here. Any of you have a reaction to that premise or to that kind of observation inside of your own organizations? Go, Suzanne.
I think we could have a whole separate discussion or panel on this particular topic, Judy, because I think now, the whole issue of sustainability and environmental climate change is suddenly at the forefront, and it should have been there for many, many years. And likewise, I'd like to say that this whole issue of inclusivity is now at the table. And I think we need to talk about inclusivity and diversity, not just as tick box exercises, but as genuine calls to action to allow those voices to be heard. And we as employees or employers and employees need to actually have the confidence to come forward and ensure that every one of our needs are met, that our demands are listened to, that we have that voice. And I think that's what these last 2 years have shown us, that everybody's voice can be heard, should be heard. And we as corporates and businesses need to go out there and get those voices out and listen to those voices.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with all that. And I'd say, from GE's perspective, it is our employees, but it's also our investors. In the last year and a half, 2 years alone, we've added a chief sustainability officer, a chief diversity officer, business level diversity officers, announced our intentions to go carbon neutral by 2030, and by 2050 be a completely net zero company, including scope 3, which is the emissions from our sold products, which for an industrial company like us is huge, and it's going to take a lot of technological leaps to get between here and there. And why is that? It's because, to your point, our employee base is demanding it. Our investors are demanding it. We're seeing it as a corporate risk issue at the enterprise level. It's a confluence of things. All of these different players are coming together to demand these outcomes and push us in the right direction, which is, from my perspective.
What's the nature of the risk piece of this, Neal?
It's the same for all of us, which is all of our businesses are going to be fundamentally changed by the fact of climate change, whether it's our businesses having to take into account more resilience for our physical and digital infrastructure, whether it's what we sell, where we sell it, how we sell it, the price we have to sell it, taking into account additional maintenance that might need to be done, the likelihood that R&D moves in this direction or that, based on different parts of the world's desire to decarbonize. It's all part of it. Our whole business models, I think every company that I know of is having a conversation at the leadership level about how climate is an enterprise risk.
So let's, we've got a couple minutes left, just a chance for each of you to maybe share something you think that is ahead of us. In other words, ahead of you, ahead of your enterprise. What piece of the, could have wave a magic wand, what piece would you unlock, or what barrier would you be able to break through, or what kind of resource would you bring to the table? Anything that kind of feels like, wow, if we could really zero in here, this is the part that I would like to see my enterprise or that I would like to be able to kind of commit to more.
I'll start with just a simple example. So, what really works well, especially for companies that have a lot of regulation, and in fact, but have a lot of stakeholder pressure, is participatory frameworks where we really engage community stakeholders, right? Listening sessions, getting out and understanding what our customers, employees, but also the society where we operate really wants from us. So those things aren't usually inexpensive exercises, and it's hard to get executives to sit down and listen, but they're super important, right? It's just sometimes they're life altering for those executives. And I'll just think back to last summer after the death of George Floyd, and having listening sessions internally and externally where our Black colleagues were just sharing their life experience, right? Their lived experience being so different from that of a typical white male manager at a bank. It just really changed things. So those kinds of opportunities, I think we should open up more to really understand what exactly is going on at the root of the societies where we operate.
We're coming to a close. Neal, just name something, and then Suzanne, you'll have the last word, or 2 words, no more.
At the intersection of inequality and future workforce, STEM. We just made a $100 million commitment to help diversify that through our Next Engineers program. This is the start. It's not going to be enough.
And Suzanne, last word to you, and thank you so much for fighting the fight and staying with us today.
Yeah, sorry about that. No, I just wish we could accelerate the pace of equity and inclusion and get rid of corruption on the continent of Africa, because that is a major hindrance to production and to scaling of any enterprise.
Well, with that, all worthy challenges and shoulder to the wheel. And God bless all of you for being with us today, and for everybody who's been listening in. Thank you for everything you're doing, and look forward to connecting with you down the road.